Good afternoon, and welcome to the last day of Arts and Science Week 2021. Thank you so much for those of you who have joined us on Zoom, who joined us in person. We're really grateful for your presence, and we are really happy to see that we could come together in community in spite of. Rebecca, first slide, please. Next slide. So this is where we started the week, and this is where I want to return. We dedicated this week to the loving memory of Jeffrey, Lorenzo, and Jen, who we lost way too soon, who came into our community and made us so much better. And for that, we'll be forever grateful. We come back to this because we want to make sure that we spend time grieving together, healing together, and moving forward together. I knowing that everyone in our community is valued and valuable, and we have to find ways to make sure we all feel valued and valuable. Next slide, please. So we're back to our North Star, the urgency of now. If you came to the first presentation of Arts and Science Week, we talked both about our students and both about the urgency of now. We described the urgency of now as coming together in community, coming together in unity, and what that means at WPI. Whether you're staff, faculty, or student, this moment means in so many ways that we need to pay special attention and recommit to the urgency of now, to the urgency of forming community, coming together again in unity. Today, as we end Arts and Science Week, it's really apropos that we're talking about self-care, that we have a professor who will talk to us about the science of sleep. She will be introduced by our co-moderators, Professor, next slide, please. Yes, she will be introduced by Professor Carolina Ruiz and Professors Janine Sorenko, who will be co-moderating this session. Again, we present to you the science of sleep. Thank you so much for joining us as we heal together, as we go forth together. Thank you so much. We appreciate you. Thank you. Carolina?
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the talk. Thank you for coming. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Gina Poe is a neuroscience professor in the Department of Integrative Biology and Physiology and the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences at UCLA. Dr. Poe graduated with a BA in Human Biology from Stanford University and a PhD in neuroscience from UCLA. She continued her training as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Arizona. Throughout her training, Dr. Poe received prestigious awards, including a Howard Hughes Medical Institute predoctoral fellowship, an NSF Minority Graduate Fellowship, and an NIH Minority Postdoctoral Award. After her postdoc, Dr. Poe held faculty positions at Washington State University and the University of Michigan Medical School before returning as a professor to her alma mater, UCLA. In her research, she studies the role of sleep for learning and memory consolidation, including what fails in mental disorders. Her research has been continuously funded by the NIH for over 20 years. She has served on the training committee and on the board of directors of the Sleep Research Society, the National Sleep Disorders Advisory Board, the Society of Neuroscience, and she's a counselor for the NINDS. She has made a concerted effort to use her many leadership roles to mentor postdoctoral, graduate, and undergraduate students in neuroscience research and to increase diversity in the sciences. Please join me in welcoming Gina. Gina, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me here for this really important week. Thank you, all of you, for taking time to be here today. And I hope to make this worth your while. I hope to be able to let you know about some of the essential functions of sleep so that you know why you're doing it and why you should not skip out on it. So let's start with talking about my laboratory, which I also want to thank. These are the students in my lab who stuck with me through the pandemic and kept me sane, and we kept each other company even while we were isolated. And so I just wanted to thank my laboratory for sticking with me and continuing the good work. So we know sleep has happened since, ancient days, and probably since the very beginning of life. And it happens homeostatically regulated. It happens even when it's very inconvenient, because when we need it, we need it. And so this is a man sleeping on a train, kind of wedging himself into a handhold so that he doesn't fall down. And we know that sleep occurs across our lifetime, from the time before we were born, actually, in the month or so just after our brain develops, which is in the last 8th and 9th month of gestation. Our brain starts to sleep, and the first state it's in is in rapid eye movement dream state. You could wonder what the heck is a baby who's had no experience dreaming about, and we do not know the answer to that, but there's plenty of it when they're first born. We also know the cyclicity of sleep, and that also remains constant throughout our lives. This is a Fitbit from my sister-in-law, Sandy. And, even though Fitbit only monitors movement and heart rate, you can tell a lot from that, because there are very characteristic, states of movement and heart rate variability that happens across sleep-waking states. But it can't tell you these signatures, which are slow waves and slow wave sleep, which is the second state we go into, then the transition to REM sleep, and then REM sleep. In the transition to REM sleep, we have sleep spindles, and in REM sleep, we have theta, and we go back and forth through these cycles. And until recently, we didn't really have that much of a clue as to why we went back and forth. But they are beautiful signatures that at first we thought maybe, could be epiphenomena, but now we know that these electrophysiological signals coming from the brain are actually doing something really important in our brain, and they only occur during sleep, and we can't get them during wakefulness. So here are some of the things we've discovered over the last 20 years about what sleep does. What are we doing? It's like cleaning up after a waking party. Every time we're awake, even if we're just sitting in a rocking chair thinking to ourselves, our brain is very highly active. We're thinking thoughts, we are processing emotions, we are, our brain is interacting with our body, and all of that produces kind of a mess in our brains. And that mess needs to be cleaned up, and specifically cleaned up during sleep. The first thing we do when we fall asleep is our brain sorts out what to throw out and what to keep. So what memories of the things that happen during the day do we want to keep? What changes do we need to throw out? And so this is just a picture from a party I had when I lived in Michigan, a winter holiday party, and everybody taking off their boots and shoes as they come in. And, after this party is over, it's a bit of a mess. I don't know if you've ever had a party in your house, but it can be quite a mess. And what you need to do is figure out, what to keep and what to throw away. And that's the same thing that the brain has to do. And the way that we throw things away once we've decided what to keep is through what is fairly newly discovered as the lymphatic system. This is something we didn't know, that the brain had a lymph system, but now we do. And that was discovered only about 6 years ago. And what we know now is that in that deep slow wave sleep state of the brain sweeps out the extracellular fluid of all the unfolded proteins and broken down enzymes, and it sweeps it into this lymphatic system and sweeps it away. It's like pumping out the garbage of our brain. And so you don't want to skip out on that portion of sleep, because if you don't get it, your brain can be filled with garbage. And one of the things that happens with Alzheimer's and dementia is as we get older, the size of those slow waves that would sweep the garbage out gets smaller and dysregulated. And so maybe that's why we build up tau and A beta and Alzheimer's disease. It's quite possible. So here are some articles. The first article in Science talking about slow wave sleep being a time to clear the brain of debris, and they injected some tau or dye into the brain, and you see it's really only cleared away from the extracellular fluid when we are asleep, especially in slow wave sleep. All right. Okay, so the next thing that we do is we do a renovation work, construction in our deep sleep state. And we do that, and we know that's true because amino acids, if you inject a tritiated amino acid systemically, you can see that radioactive amino acid is only taken up into proteins during slow wave sleep. It doesn't happen in wakefulness, it doesn't happen in REM, but only during slow wave sleep. So if you want to build proteins or repair your body, this isn't just in the brain, this is all over the body. This happens in this deep slow wave state of sleep. So, and that's what happens early in the night. I don't know if you remember my graph, but that deep slow wave sleep is what happens when you first go to sleep, and there's much less of it, and it's much less efficient if you don't go to sleep until the wee hours of the morning. You don't get that state of repair. So growth hormone is released in a big bolus in slow wave sleep to allow us to build and grow and repair. So you really don't want to skip out on that state. And then the next thing that happens also in slow wave sleep is we're able to restock the depleted energy stores. The longer we're awake, the more ATP is broken down into adenosine. And so the more adenosine builds up. And then when we go to sleep, you can see over just a period of 30 minutes time, you can see that adenosine levels are converted back to ATP. And this happens because there's a circadian control over the enzymes that convert adenosine to ATP, and that convert it back during wakefulness. And so you really also want your sleep and your circadian rhythms to be aligned like they normally are, so that all of these things can happen in concert. And then you can see when we wake up again, the adenosine builds back up again. All right, so, and then the last thing I want to talk about a little bit today is how we integrate new information. And that's something that's really important to you in college. Integrate new information into our old schema. And that happens in that transition to REM, stage 2 sleep, and during REM sleep, that active dreaming state. That's also when we consolidate our memories. And that's what I mean by that is that we transfer our memories from temporary storehouses in the hippocampus, like writing RAM, to long-term memory. The long-term memory is distributed in a parallel associated fashion throughout our neocortex. And that happens through that dream state of REM. And we can also dream up new solutions to problems that we are encountering. If you're taking a math class that's sort of blowing your mind, you might read the textbook and find yourself just inexorably drawn to sleep, put your head down and take a nap, even if you got a pretty good night's sleep the night before. And that sleep attack is because your brain is calling for sleep to help you consolidate and put together that new information into your old schema. All right, so one of the things that happens when we have that M2 transition to REM sleep and REM sleep, these are the states that my research concentrates on most, is that an area of your brainstem called the locus coeruleus falls silent for several seconds. And this locus coeruleus is down here in the brainstem. This is where your eye would be, and the nose, this would be in profile here, your nose and chin. So down here deep in the brain, there's a tiny, tiny area comprised of just several thousand neurons that are contain norepinephrine and provide that norepinephrine all over the brain. And when that nucleus is firing, that's when you are orienting to something new, when it helps you learn very quickly. So hopefully it's firing right now as I speak. But it also becomes highly active, physically active, when we are stressed out. So when any kind of thing that would stress our bodies, whether it be a physical stressor, an emotional stressor, a psychological stressor, all of that, the locus coeruleus is highly responsive because it helps us to learn what's going on and orient and figure that out so that we can avoid it in the future. So you don't want that nucleus to be overactive, and really the only time it is completely silent, and that is what we hypothesize being the time that can actually resolve those emotional memories during those silences, is during that N2 transition to REM sleep, and REM sleep itself when it's completely silent. And in fact, there are mental health disorders that are associated with the inability to silence our locus coeruleus across sleep. All right, so I'm just showing you where it is in this baby's brain, kind of way back there. It actually is a nucleus in every animal that has a brain. And so that's really seems to be a universal thing. So that locus coeruleus stops firing before every sleep spindle, and the function of that silence seems to be that it allows us to not only write things into our long-term memory stores, but also to erase all of those things that we learned during the day that are irrelevant, and to divorce our emotions from our memory. For example, if you learn something traumatic, and you have a very strong emotional response, that emotional response gets sewn into the rest of the memory, just like everything else does. But during sleep and during the silences of this locus coeruleus, we can actually downscale those emotions and other sensory information from that memory, so we can remember the facts of the matter without having to feel all the emotions forever for the rest of our lives whenever we recall those things. And again, people that have, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder, their locus coeruleus does not silence during these states of sleep. Insomnia disorder is also characterized by too much locus coeruleus activity. Unfortunately, we've not actually measured the locus coeruleus activity in women or in female animals. So that's something my laboratory is working on, because women are 2 to 4 times more susceptible to mental health disorders that involve stress. And so we're trying to figure out what is going on in females across sleep that might make us more vulnerable at times to mental health disorders. So once our memories are consolidated from our short-term structures in our hippocampus, which is in our temporal lobe here, to the cortex, in a parallel distributed fashion. This is my son about 11 years ago doing this in his sleep. Then we can erase these memories from this temporary memory structure, the hippocampus. So, and that we can do that, and it's important to do that to avoid saturation of this associative memory structure. And so this is, again, the locus coeruleus in the brainstem, and you can see how it projects all over the neocortex. The only time it's silent is during that N2 transition and REM sleep time. So here is just kind of a conceptual model of based on a lot of evidence that we have now that shows that sleep spindles, those things that actually, I haven't really described sleep spindles to you yet. They are 1.5 second long, 10 to 15 hertz squiggles that occur in our brain. And they are a time of unique connectivity between our hippocampus and the rest of our brain. And it seems to be a time when we're writing those memories out to the rest of our brain during those sleep spindles. Sleep spindles their density is correlated with our intelligence, and our ability to increase our sleep spindle density after a learning session is predictive of how well we will have learned that in the next testing period. So again, sleep is not something you want to skip out on. You know, when I was an undergraduate at Stanford University, there were a lot of times when I spent all-nighters trying to cram information in just before the exam. And I can tell you that although I did okay on most of my exams, those memories were not consolidated because I didn't get sleep because I was doing these all-nighters. And there are courses I look at back, I've saved some of the books, and I can't even believe that I took the course, much less, knew what I seemed to have known at that time. So I suggest that you don't squander your education by not sleeping. Let those memories become long-term memories by just sleeping and studying as you go along. All right, so spindles incorporate that new information into your existing circuits. And this happens during the sleep spindles. When you learn something new, it can be incorporated into your schema of the world. And then during REM sleep, during the theta rhythm that occurs in the hippocampus during REM sleep and elsewhere in the brain, you can actually erase, my research shows that you can actually erase all of the circuits and portions of your circuit that are no longer correct, given the new information, or no longer necessary to be stored in the short-term memory structures. If you don't have good sleep, if you have maladaptive sleep or no sleep at all, those new novel information isn't incorporated into the schema, like the fact that I've forgotten so much since my undergraduate days. And if that sleep is not characterized by a silence in the locus coeruleus, the noradrenaline containing cells in the locus coeruleus, then instead of erasing the parts of that schema that are no longer relevant, instead REM sleep just continues to reinforce those problematic, like emotional parts of our memory. So here we will just review again the functions of sleep, and we've only been through about 19 slides so far. And so if you need to go take a nap and consolidate these things, you are welcome to. But the next part of the talk is more fun, so I suggest that you hang in there a little bit. So slow wave sleep is to clear the garbage and restore and build. It uses the lymphatic system, enzymes through the circadian system to convert adenosine to ATP, and growth hormone release to make proteins all over our bodies. That transition to REM N2 state is to integrate old information, new information with the old, consolidate it to the cortex, transferring it from temporary to long-term structures through sleep spindles. And then REM sleep is to clean away those things we no longer need to remember. And also, what I didn't really talk about is there's a lot of activity that occurs during REM sleep. And that activity seemed to us a long time ago to be random, but now we know through animal studies that it is not random at all, that we are reactivating memories that couldn't necessarily be activated at the same time. And we can use that time to reimagine and be creative in any way that we need to be creative. Weakens old connections and strengthens new. All right, so I see that there is a question in the chat. So yes, is sleep in the brain different in neurodivergent versus neurotypical people? And yes, the answer to that is yes, yes, yes. Almost every brain diversity in our brains is characterized by diversity in sleep as well. So it's really interesting that that autism, for example, is characterized by very strong differences. People with autism don't have the same structure of sleep, and that neurotypical people do. And that's just one of many examples. All right. All right. So going on to some fun stuff. This is the cycles of sleep, and these are the states that I talked about earlier. We go from wakefulness to slow wave sleep, where we clean the junk out so that we can then concentrate on what we need to keep and how we need to file the new information away in our brains. That's a time when we have atonia, which is when our muscles are actively inhibited, and we have atonia because we don't want to be acting out the strong dreams that we are having at that time. So it's a very adaptive state. And then that state of high activity can, like waking, create junk and use a lot of energy that needs to be restored again during slow wave sleep. And the new connections that you've made need to be shored up and built out with protein synthesis in that state. And that's why we go back and forth from one state to the next until the job is done and we wake up. And I suggest that you go to bed early enough in the evening so that you can spontaneously awaken and not have to awaken with the alarm clock, because the alarm clock would curtail this process before your brain is actually done doing its work. So if you can try doing that, and you will feel so much better in every way. So again, this is just a nod to the cycle and the fact that it has to happen in order. And it has to happen until the cycle is done. And I'm likening it to a washing machine, because if you wake up, which is like opening the door of the washing machine in the middle of, say, slow wave sleep, which might be considered like the time when there's soap and water in your clothes, then you're going to have a sopping mess. And in fact, if you wake up out of slow wave sleep, that's the time when you feel the worst. If you wake up out of slow wave sleep, you have big sleep inertia. If you ask someone what was going on, they'll say, I don't know, just let me go back to sleep. And so you don't want to wake up out of that stage. You want to go back into REM sleep. Waking up out of REM sleep is actually the most refreshing, and we feel the most alert. But again, if you wake up too soon out of REM sleep, you don't let REM sleep do its job of helping to regulate our emotional system, for example, or do the work, the creativity work that happens in that dream state. Also, if you get less sleep, what happens is all of those states that I described earlier vie for the same bit of time that you are in bed. And so they crunch together, and you get these kind of dissociated states when both REM sleep and slow wave sleep are trying to manifest at the same time. And that's when you get things like night terrors, where you're vocalizing the emotions that you're having in REM sleep, but you're still deeply unconscious, like you're in slow wave sleep. So if you've ever heard a child or yourself been through a night terror, they don't remember it. But it is terrifying for parents, because your child is screaming and moaning and crying, but they are really definitely unconscious. Another one is sleep paralysis. That's another dissociated state where we are awake, conscious, but our atonia mechanisms that inhibit us from acting out our dreams are still active. So that's another dissociated state that happens more when we're sleep deprived, and all those states are vying for the same amount of time. Confusional arousals is another one where it's kind of a mixture of everything, and it can be kind of scary. Sleepwalking and talking happen in slow wave sleep, and it's when you're waking and slow wave sleep are also vying for the same time. And then, of course, REM behavior disorder, when you actually act out your dreams, that's a very dangerous one, and that happens when your atonia mechanisms are not in place, but you're still having those active, vivid dreams. Okay, so what happens if we don't get, besides those dissociated states? We also feel cranky and short-tempered, inflexible, hard to handle, impulsive, accident-prone. This happens especially in toddlers, but it happens a lot in adults as well, like you and me. We are hungrier for junk food. I don't know if you've ever tried to pull all-nighter. I do not suggest it, but you'll get very hungry for a candy bar about 4 a.m. You also get more prone to infection and illness if you are sleep depriving yourself. And that's because of something that I haven't mentioned as a major function of sleep, but it really is. And that's for our immune system. So it's true, if you get a vaccine, a shot of vaccine, and then you don't sleep well that night, or you don't sleep at all that night, the vaccine is 50% as effective as it would be if you get a good night's sleep after a vaccine. So that's something to also think about in this day and age. Also, our memory is not as good. We have less insight, we're more pedantic, less able to abstract, more anxious and depressed and angry. If you give a toddler a puzzle to do with one piece missing, and they do the whole puzzle, and then they come to that fact that they can't find that last piece, if they haven't had their nap, they will more likely throw that puzzle across the room and scream and cry and have a tantrum than a well-rested child who will just kind of accept that as, wow, that's kind of a bummer, right? So that's true of adults as well. All right, so other really important things happened for development and in our brains while we sleep. When we take our very first steps, that's because we have a lot of that spindle sleep and that REM sleep state when we're born with a kind of an over connected brain, and that becomes, the connections increase even more in our first few months of life. But also when we are learning, what we have to do is trim away all of those connections that are not relevant to a very fine, refined task like walking or learning to talk. So we have a lot of those, that N2 state and the REM sleep state in the first few months of life, after which time, by the time you're about as old as you are, you have the full adult cycle, and you still have plenty of that insight and connectivity sleep of N2 sleep, but our amounts of slow wave sleep start to drop. And by the time you're as old as I am out here, we have much, much less of it. So we really have to guard our sleep even more carefully as we get older, because there's just less opportunity to have that cleaning state of sleep. And this is a recent paper we published that's showing how correlated the amount of REM sleep is to our increase in brain mass in the first few months and years of life. This is my nephew taking his first steps. Yay! That's my sister saying yay. And so there's a lot of really important stuff that happens. So for God's sake, do not sleep deprive a baby. Never wake a sleeping baby. This is why there's so much happening in the brain that's really requires sleep to occur. And that relationship between REM sleep and total sleep goes away after about age 3. That's when a lot of our schema are built in these first few years of life, after which time sleep seems to take a different function, which is more the cleaning and repairing majority. And we're still doing some synaptic modification with learning. And so we'll get to now the sort of the last part of my talk, which is who sleeps. And we now know that everybody sleeps, from whales to worms. And believe it or not, most of my career, people didn't think that worms slept, because you ask someone who works with C. elegans, this is a C. elegans, if their worms ever slept, they would say no, because whenever they had under their bright light of their microscope, the worms were squirming. So it's partly the problem with the way that we were measuring it. Whales, we know they have to breathe, so they can seem to be continually swimming, but we ignored the fact that there are times when they are diving under the water, so you can't see them when you're from a boat, and they're just completely suspended in that water, motionless. And that is when both hemispheres of their brain are asleep at the same time, and they're probably in that rapid eye movement state when they have atonia, when they're in that configuration. So we used to think that only mammals and birds had REM sleep because we could measure it from the cortex. But now we know that really every animal that we've looked at probably has these two major states, non-REM and REM sleep, from dragon lizards to Drosophila. Even though Drosophila don't have REM sleep because their eyes don't move, they do have limbs that twitch with myoclonic jerks, just like we do during REM sleep. And in these dragon lizards, their eyes twitch and their muscles twitch too. So all of these animals, not just mammals, seem to have these two states of sleep. Dogs, cats, rats, birds, giraffes, and yes, humans too. All right, so So there's besides Drosophila, there's even a lower a lower animal that seems to sleep, an animal that doesn't even have a central nervous system. It has ganglia, and that's the jellyfish. So you can see how the jellyfish pulse. This is Cassiopeia, pulsing during wakefulness at a fairly rapid rate. And then you can see how it pulses during sleep. It's a slower rate. And this, if you disturb it of this slow pulsing state of sleep, they will homeostatically regulate it and try and get more of it the next time. So this is disturbing the poor Cassiopeia with a jet of water. And as you can see, it's pulsing faster again, but it goes right back to sleep. So it homeostatically regulates. If you add caffeine to the water, they will stay awake longer, just like we do. This is their pulse rate during the daytime, and then this is at night. When they're sleeping, their pulse rate's much slower. And this is in a supplemental figure of this paper from Caltech. And what they don't even describe is these periods of time, these seconds at a time, when the Cassiopeia isn't pulsing at all. That means it's not breathing, just like the whales suspended in water, not breathing for a period of time. And I would hypothesize, although we haven't tested it yet, that these Cassiopeia are in this second stage of sleep, which is rapid eye movement sleep with atonia. So even the lowly jellyfish seems to have these two states of sleep. So we talked a little bit about what each state might do. And so I just want to say what happens now what kinds of things can disturb our sleep. And one of the things could be our job, whether it be the job of being in college, going to parties, or if you're a physician, a resident on call. You can see this is the waking schedule of a resident on call, which does not get a lot of sleep throughout the night compared to when he's not on call. And this is here he has to do his morning rounds, he or she. This sleep was terribly fragmented. And I feel sorry for the patients that physician has to see that next morning, because if you think about, pedantic qualities, less able to put things together, the standard of care is going to be less. And in fact, there have been studies to show that physicians do make more mistakes, not only physicians, nurses also, if they've had disturbed or shortened sleep the night before. So next time you have to go to the ER, you might ask your resident, how much sleep did you get last night? Another thing that disturbs our sleep is light. That disturbs our circadian rhythms, which is supremely sensitive to light. And devices like the one you have in front of you now, which is your computer, that light, that blue light given to our brains at the wrong time, can actually reset our rhythms and delay our circadian phase, so that those things that I talked about needing to be in alignment when we fall asleep no longer are in alignment. This is the amount of light pollution in the United States in the late 50s, middle 70s. This is 1997, and this is what is projected to be in 2025, a lot of light at night. So I exhort you to protect yourself, especially from the blue light of your devices at night. Leave it to the morning time. Another thing that can disturb our sleep is sleep apnea. That occurs more in older people than younger people, but still there are some young people who also suffer from sleep apnea. That's when because your airway is already smaller because of buildup of fat, or because our muscles are more relaxed during sleep, our big tongue can actually fall back and close off our airway. So we're trying to breathe, our diaphragm is pulling down and trying to suck air in, but it's doing so against a closed airway. And that happens until you wake up a little bit and restore your muscle tone so you can breathe. And people diagnosed with sleep apnea can do that way over 5 times. The minimum diagnosis for sleep apnea is 5 times an hour. And that's a lot. That's a lot of arousals. A mild case is even 17 times an hour. You have to wake up to breathe. So there are treatments for it. If you know anybody with sleep apnea that seems to not be breathing while they sleep, do get them to a doctor, because it can be really bad for your heart. Oxygen levels drop, and it's bad for your brain for all the reasons I talked about. So here is a picture. I was in Japan, and if you're riding the trains or the subways there, you find the majority of people are actually asleep. And that's because it's a very, very sleep deprived society, the least sleeping society. And it's also a society where suicides, our rate is really, really high. But you can see that what they do and they try to do is make up for that lack of sleep by sleeping when they can. This guy probably is actually drunk, not just asleep, but you can see that there's a lot more sleeping in public. Here is a woman who's devised or bought a prop for her chin. It's a tripod so that she can sleep on the train standing up without falling over. And here's a cool invention of an open eye that you can tape. It's just a sticker you could tape to your eyelids so you can sleep while you're in class and look like you're awake. The things that we do. I would suggest you just get your sleep because it's so important. So the next question I want to just tackle for another minute here is whether sleeping aids like benzodiazepines or the zolpidem drugs or other things allow you to have normal sleep. Is this sleep that lets you accomplish what you would like to do, your brain would like to do? So there's a nice slide. It's in a publication. I can get that for you, but it summarizes the various sleep drugs and how they work and what the side effects are, and some notes like this that can cause memory loss. And that's because they bind to GABA receptors that are involved in sleep and wakefulness and also in memory control. So, if you're interested in getting sleep, that if you're having difficulty sleeping and you're interested in getting sleep that's as normal as possible, well, you're young enough that melatonin agonists probably won't work because your melatonin release is probably nice and large. As you get older, though, that melatonin, just like many other hormones, reduces amplitude. So you could take a melatonin agonist and probably help yourself get to sleep and have a good normal night's sleep. What I do not recommend is alcohol. A lot of people try and self-medicate with alcohol. Alcohol is also a GABA agonist, but it is also an antagonist of receptors that help you learn. So, and it also suppresses the amount of rapid eye movement sleep and that transition to REM sleep. So a lot of these drugs actually do suppress the amount of rapid eye movement sleep in favor of slow wave sleep. So it's not a good night's sleep. I have this picture of pancakes here. You may have been wondering why. I had a neighbor in Michigan who, whenever she would take Ambien, she would have these bizarre dissociated states and often would find herself waking up in the morning, going to her kitchen and finding a whole stack of pancakes that she had cooked that night before under the influence of Ambien. And it's just a dissociated and abnormal state. Okay, so on our last note, so I have some time for questions. I'd like to talk a little bit about caffeine, because that's something a lot of us use to try and overcome our sleepiness when we don't get enough sleep, and just tell you what caffeine actually does. I talked about the buildup of adenosine across wakefulness, adenosine being a byproduct of energy metabolism. When we use ATP when it's for energy, and that ATP gets broken down to adenosine diphosphate, monophosphate, and then adenosine. It turns out that sleep sensing, sleep driving neurons in our basal forebrain here in front and at the bottom sense that adenosine, and that drives us to go to sleep. And so what caffeine does is it blocks that signal of built up adenosine at the receptors. So your brain doesn't know, it doesn't sense that there's a bunch of adenosine floating around. And so it thinks that you've just woken up refreshed from a nice nap or a night's sleep. So adenosine can be high and doing what it does, which is not necessarily good stuff. But caffeine just blocks that signal. It doesn't actually help us do all the brain things that our brain needs to do when we're asleep. It just fools our brain into thinking that we're refreshed. So I would not recommend caffeine in the long term to overcome our sleepiness, because it's just kicking down the road the important things that sleep needs to do, including restoring ATP levels. Instead, if you can, take a power nap. A power nap, you only need 20-30 minutes of sleep. Before that, adenosine levels are right back up to, or right back down, and ATP is right back up to where you need it. So I would not recommend a power nap to try and replace all of sleep, because of that cycle that I told you about. That's really important, that it goes back and forth between the different states, and a power nap does not contain that deep slow wave sleep state or transition to REM or REM sleep that you need to consolidate your memories. All right, so with that, I will just say, honor your sleep. Your brain is hard at work doing things that it can't do when you're awake. So don't think you're being lazy. Don't let your parents, when you go home for the breaks, tell you you're lazy by sleeping until noon. You are doing important work trying to consolidate all that stuff that you learned before the break. So thank you very much. I appreciate your attention today. And with that, I guess I'll take some questions.
Thank you so much. This was excellent. Round of applause. So to start with some of the questions, I wanted to see, Professor Ruiz, do you have a question? Because I know that you have to head out for your class.
Yes, I'm leaving in a moment to teach class. I see a number of very interesting questions, so I'll ask a quick one before I go. So thank you so much, Gina, for all the information and all the advice about behaviors to avoid so that we can have a better sleep. Other behaviors that might be related and that would be useful to know as well, your opinion on these kind of relationships of sleep and exercise, for example, sleep and social activity and things of the sort.
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much for asking it. Exercise is actually really good for a good night's sleep with that big, deep, slow waves. But you don't want to get it within 2 hours of bedtime, because exercise within 2 hours of bedtime also hypes up our system. For example, that locus coeruleus system and the dorsal raphe serotonergic system both get really stimulated during exercise. And you want those systems to be calm and quiet, so that you can slip nicely into sleep. But it's been shown study after study that exercise actually helps your sleep be more efficient. More growth hormone is released. The slow wave size is bigger no matter what your age. And so I highly recommend getting some exercise. There was something else you talked about.
Social activity.
Oh, social. Yeah, social activity can be wonderful. But again, right before bed, what you'll want to do is social activities that help calm and relax you, not social activities that hype you up. It's like, don't have an argument with your roommate just before trying to go to sleep, because that's going to make your locus coeruleus fire a lot. And when you go into REM sleep, it might still be firing and then make your sleep maladaptive instead of adaptive. So apologize, kiss and make up before you go to sleep.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I know I'm looking through the attendees, and we have a lot of students who are taking our psych experimental design and analysis class here today. Good. So my first question, and then I'll get to what's coming in the Q&A, is can you just tell us a little bit more about how you conduct this research, since we've got a good group here who are really interested in the science behind this and the methods that we use? Oh
yeah, great question. So I started out recording from sleeping cats, because cats are predators and predators sleep great. Just like this dog behind me who is tearing up something that he shouldn't be tearing up. But anyway, I'm going to ignore her for now. Anyway, so yeah, predators sleep really great. And so it's a really nice thing to study sleep in these animals. Of course, when you do sleep research want to make sure that they're comfortable and happy, because otherwise they won't sleep. So that's really an important part. And that's one of the things I love doing, because I'm a sleep researcher, is I I get to treat animals nicely. And so we do have electrodes implanted into their brains during anesthesia and surgery. But as people have told us who have electrodes implanted in their brain, that it's not painful. We don't have sensory receptors in our brain. And so our animals behave perfectly normally when they're got these head caps with these electrodes implanted. So we record from their brains while they're learning and then while they're sleeping to see how neurons are replayed and see if the replay is consistent with strengthening memories or erasing memories. And we look at the age of the memory to see whether or not our brains know the consolidation state of that memory. And it turns out to be beautifully elegant. The brain knows, and we're thinking it's through microcircuits and neurotransmitters that I talked about today. That we know when to erase what we need to erase and when to keep what we need to keep. But we're still looking into other things like how do we gain insight? And so we have now rats doing a very difficult task that's analogous to an insight task that we've given humans. And 2/3 of the rats don't get it the first time we try and test them, but after sleep, half of those rats do get it. And the other half don't. And so we are trying to see what's going on in their brain of those that get it versus those that don't, that let them have insight and versus did not gain insight. And what happens during wakefulness to tag the parts of the memory that need to be tagged so they get reactivated during sleep in the manner that needs to be reactivated. Yeah.
That's so fascinating. So I don't do rats, so good for you. I can't do rodents. So let's see here. So I'm hoping maybe too, since we're talking a little bit about mental health and some issues that have been emerging, if you could talk a little bit, and I see a question here related to disordered sleep and predictors of depression symptoms in general. So what is the link between mental health and sleep? Is there a link?
Oh yeah, there's a very, very tight link, and something that I'll just jump right into females, something that the research community has been terrible at studying females, historically terrible. And there seem to be some major differences in the way that women sleep over the menstrual cycle. So during states of high hormones, estrogen and progesterone, we actually sleep a lot less, but that sleep that we get is really efficient. And what I mean by efficient is the areas of the brain that need to be synchronized during the sleep spindles is synchronized. And the height of our slow waves is really big. And we have more sleep spindles during that time. And then the other phases, when we have low estrogen, our sleep is a lot less efficient. We get more of it, but it's a lot less efficient. And preliminary data from my laboratory and my graduate students are finding is that our locus coeruleus doesn't necessarily quiet down completely in REM sleep when estrogen levels are low. And so these phases of our menstrual cycle may make us more vulnerable to stress-related mental health disorders, especially if we had a trauma during that time. So yes, every mental health disorder is characterized by some sleep change, and the specific nature of that sleep change depends on what the disorder exactly is. So that's a great question.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions in here on like, what happens if you miss sleep? So can you catch up on it? Can you reset your system? And what are the consequences? Right. Like, is it reversible if you've been deprived of sleep?
Right. No, that's a great question. And, we've done decades of sleep restriction and sleep deprivation studies in humans without knowing the answer to that, whether the changes that we are affecting are permanent. And there's some interesting studies in mice recently that show that locus coeruleus structure that I talked about starts degenerating immediately with even just 6 hours of sleep deprivation in mice. Thankfully, the permanent damage to the locus coeruleus is mitigated by antioxidants. So if you eat some blueberries, at least you won't have locus coeruleus cells that die, but you put them in danger and you stress them out, even with, and these mice are self-sleep depriving because they're having a great party. You put a bunch of mice together in a big arena where they're running around and having fun with all kinds of things to do. just like maybe video games with us or a party, and still that locus coeruleus gets stressed out, even if it's a positive stressor, and starts to degenerate unless we can mitigate that. So there might be permanent changes that I put into my brain by doing all those all-nighters as an undergraduate. And so now that I'm 56 years old, I'm a little more afraid that I might have too few locus coeruleus cells to sustain my memory function. Yeah, so can you make up for it? There is rebound sleep. It depends on when you get it, which state of sleep you're going to rebound more. But there are critical periods of time after you learn something that you have to sleep in order to preserve those memories and to consolidate them. And if you don't get it within that period of time, even if you get plenty of sleep later, you will never consolidate that thing that you tried to learn. Yeah.
Interesting. So you also talked a little bit about factors that could interrupt our sleep, especially like the blue lights. So there's questions about other things that may be playing a role besides light. So what if there's a radio playing or people are talking?
Right.
Just sound influence sleep?
Yes, it does. It does. Yeah, it is interesting. If you've got noisy neighbors upstairs, you will eventually get used to that and be able to sleep through their, stomping around. However, research does show that stomping does lighten our sleep from deep to lighter. And so even if we are able to sleep and don't remember waking up, we may wake up partially and it might disturb our sleep. So another thing the thing that people in the United States complain about disturbing their sleep most is either young children, if you're a parent, babies, or pets. Pets often, wanting to get up in the middle of the night and go outside or come inside or jump up on our bed or whatever they do, they disturb our sleep also. And then as we get older, it's being unable to sleep through the night without getting up to pee. So those are some of the other things that seem to disturb our sleep. Yeah.
Sadly, pets and the last thing are in my household all the time. So some people are also asking questions about like how much sleep do we need, or do some people need more sleep than others? Is it different between infants and adults?
Yes. As you saw, infants need more sleep. It's somewhat dependent on what we're doing during the day because it's homeostatically regulated. And if we need more sleep because we've learned something, mind-blowing that day before, then we need more. But the amount of sleep needed does vary from person to person, and it's unclear exactly why that's the case. But some people who seem to only need, 4 to 6 hours of sleep a night and function really well, high functioning during the day. Again, we don't know what's happening to their locus coeruleus by getting so little sleep, but they seem to function really well. And there seems to be a different set of genes or epigenetic regulation so that their sleep may be more efficient, but we really don't fully understand that. Another thing that why some people need to sleep along, we don't know. Maybe it's less efficient sleep, or maybe they have more need for sleep. So I talked about sleep for the immune system. Maybe their immune system needs more time to be supported. Or they have sleep apnea that's been undiagnosed, so they need to sleep longer in order to get the same total amount. It will still be disturbed sleep and not in that beautiful cycle pattern, but they will need to have more sleep. So if you find yourself needing more than 9 hours of sleep a night, I would suggest going to your doctor and asking about that, because it could be a sign that there's something else going on, like sleep apnea or an infection or some illness that you didn't know you had. Yeah.
Perfect. So I know we're at time. There's tons of questions still popping in. So Jean, do we have a few more minutes, or are we wrapping up?
We need to, because the students need, but one last question. How is that?
Okay.
Perfect. Let's see. I'm trying to find one. There's a bunch of questions in here about things like, so you were talking about naps and power naps, for instance. So do you recommend creating spaces like in employment, like in a workplace or on a campus, where people could go and do their power naps?
Yes. Yes, yes, yes. And I think colleges especially should have nap places because you're expected to learn a lot and absorb a lot. And a nice nap that includes REM sleep, so an hour and a half long nap, can be as good as an entire night to stabilize and start the consolidation process for a memory. It's actually not good to have class after class after class in a single day, which is the way our educational systems are structured. It would be much better to just intensively concentrate on one class for all morning, and then take a nice nap, and then maybe have another class before your evening time, and just structure it that way. 4 classes a day are not good. Yeah, so great question. And yes, I highly support cots for napping on college campuses.
Perfect. All right, we'll get on that. King, add it to the list.
Yeah.
So that is all the time we have. Thanks everyone for all of your great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but I think we hinted at a good chunk of them. Thank you, Gina Poe, so much for joining us today. This is really fascinating.
Yes, I really appreciate being invited, and I encourage all of you, especially those doing sports, to get your sleep and don't rob yourself of it. You need it just as much because you're doing all the learning things as well as all the physical things where your muscles need to be rebuilt. So anyway, all of you, get your sleep. Thank you so much. I hope to visit your campus someday in person.
Yeah, we hope to have you. And I want to thank the co-moderators, Professor Sorinko and Professor Ruiz, for this session. This was fabulous, Gina, as I know it would be. Thank you so much. And again, next time you come into campus, and we're really excited for all your good work, and keep up the great work. And now that we have to get cots around campus, I'm saying if you want to come sleep in my office, feel free. And
great
to everybody,
idea.
again, thank you. And thanks to all of you. It has been a fabulous Arts and Science Week. It was a difficult one, but we got through it. We'll heal together. We'll move forward together. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Gina. We really appreciate your time. Bye, Janine. Bye, everybody. Have a good one.
Bye.
Take care. Have a good weekend. Bye.